All right, let's have some fun up in here. Welcome to the Ben and Blue podcast. I am one of those Bens. I'm Ben Stenhaug, here to welcome you to the show today. We're very excited to have you here. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I think you will. Today, we're going to dive into the idea of active learning versus traditional lecturing. So, traditional lecturing, I am sure you are familiar with. It's what almost everyone experiences for almost all of their educational experience. Imagine you're sitting in the back of a class. It's kind of fluorescently lit. It's early. Maybe it's late. You're watching the clock. It's probably an hour long. There's someone up there talking in a monotone voice. They're writing on the whiteboard. Maybe you're expected to write down verbatim what they're writing. And you don't like it. And honestly, we've looked into the research, and you're not learning much either. Carl Wieman is a researcher at Stanford. He's looked into the relative effectivenesses of active learning versus traditional lecturing approaches. And his conclusion, he's got a great one-line just censure on it, which is that traditional lecturing is the educational equivalent of bloodletting. I'm going to say that one more time. The educational equivalent of bloodletting. Now, what is bloodletting? I had to look it up. It's the surgical removal of blood for therapeutic purposes. I bet you've never had that done. Why is that? Because within the last couple hundred years, we found out it doesn't work. We know bloodletting doesn't work. There's no therapy that comes from this surgical removal of blood. So when you go to the doctor's office, guess what? It doesn't happen. Well, traditional lecture is the educational equivalent of it because equivalently it doesn't work. However, when you show up to school, when you show up to whatever educational environment you might go to, you're probably getting a traditional lecture. It's as bad as going to the doctor and having them removing blood as a form of therapy. It's honestly really messed up, and it bothers me. It really bothers me because if you think about all the students in our country learning, spending so much time in the educational system, all the money we're pouring into it, if you think about the backbone of the pedagogy of the instructional method that we're using is something that we know is bloodletting, it's really messed up, especially when you talk about some of the inequities here. If you talk about all the downstream consequences of this for our country, for our world, of having a more poorly educated group of people, of civilians, of citizens. And so that's sad. That's sad. And Ben and Blue, we dive into why that's the case. We dive into some of that research. And I think it's a fantastic conversation. And I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to do that. I'll give one more personal anecdote, which is I'm entering my second year here in the PhD program at Stanford. And this is where Carl Wieman does this research. This is where Joe Bowler, to drop another pretty big name, does research on mathematical mindsets and how we can bring the math classroom alive with active learning. And as a part of getting my PhD here, I need to take courses from people like these. I haven't taken courses with either of those particular people, but in these courses, maybe a few doors down from where these guys are doing their research, I'm receiving traditional lectures because I'm not sure why, but it seems messed up. If in the Mecca, if in the place at which we know we're learning, we're doing the research to find out this is bloodletting, we're still using traditional lectures, probably over 50% of the time. That's really, really, really sad. It's really hard. And what hope do we have for the other places that students are learning in the country if at the Mecca we're not even doing active learning there as much as we should be? Without further ado, kicking it over to the full team, Ben and Blue, and you can listen to us dive into traditional lecturing versus active learning.
If I was to bring up a question like, is lecturing the best use of classroom time? Let's say we isolate to math and science type classes. This would be a very short episode because pretty quickly we'd all kind of nod our heads and agree that lecturing is not the best use of anyone's time, right? The teacher is there as an expert who can address specific misconceptions that students have. And without getting any kind of feedback about what those misconceptions are, other than hoping that people raise their hands, that's not highly utilized. And same deal on the student end, everyone would agree that passive watching is not the best way when there's an opportunity for more active, either classroom, group activities, structured problems that have more of an immediate feedback. So the question, what is the inertia of lectures, right? Why is it the case that that is still the standard and that is the natural instinct of someone when they are given a classroom full of students and maybe a couple weeks that they're told you have to cover this material, that the default behavior is to go up and spend most of the hour they have lecturing?
Well, I guess first off, no arguments on lecturing not being a great use of time. I don't know if we were going to discuss that, but
well, yeah, I guess maybe we can discuss this. I'm taking it as an assumption here that we would all agree on that. Is that even a fair assumption?
So I think that's a super fair assumption. When you kind of give me a slight heads up, we might be talking about this. I just tried to find evidence for that. And it looks like within the past couple of years, there's like a huge meta study done of all of the studies of active learning versus lecture methods. And you have like decreases in failure rates from like 34% to 22%. You have like increases in post-test scores of like 0.5 standard deviations. It seems to me like you're right. It seems like anyone thinking to ask this question is coming up with the answer that lecturing is worse than active learning, if you've asked it.
I would put in one slightly contrarian view, which is there might be a certain use case, which is motivation. I can imagine a very motivating lecture from a very charismatic speaker who is fine-tuned a lecture, almost like a TED Talk in a way. TED Talks are very motivating and have value to watch them, even though they're essentially lectures. But that's certainly not, I wouldn't build a class or a course around it.
And I think it depends also what we mean by lecture. Because when you say that you don't want to lecture, it's not the same as saying that you don't want to tell students something. Going up to the board and describing something for a minute, or noticing in your classroom that people seem to be tired or not motivated, and then like reminding them of the goals of the classroom or something, that's telling them something. That's like maybe a lecture in some sort of definition, but that's not what we're talking about, right? You're talking about motivating lectures and like something kind of completely different, and maybe that wouldn't even happen in a math class necessarily.
No, I can't say I've ever seen it happen in a class, but I can imagine, a 10 or 15 minute inspiring talk about a subject before you dive into it, or maybe after you've gotten a little bit of a taste for it to really see how it could be used or applied. But I think lectures in terms of an hour and a half exposition of new content, I don't think there's much use for that.
In fact, I think some of the best lectures that I actually remember from college are the day one lectures that were clearly prepared with the intent of motivation and less of first contact with a new topic. And that kind of really cuts to your point about the role being much more akin to that of a TED Talk. So if we do agree, and it does sound like we do agree, it still just raises this question, why that's the natural instinct. And I'm willing to claim that it's the natural instinct, at the very least from personal experience. I haven't been a teacher in like the full-time sense, but there are times when I've had a classroom of students to teach a couple things for a little bit of time. And I can say without some sort of conscious effort, what will happen is that I talk during the time. This summer, there was a open-ended Inspire Middle Schoolers About Math type course that it was just like come in an hour every week and we'd talk about something. And partly because I think middle schoolers are horrifying and I don't really know what to do with them, I probably spent more than 50% of the time, not all of it, but more than 50%, which is probably more than okay, lecturing, trying to describe a thing that they had not seen before for the first time with my voice and with my drawings on the whiteboard. And in hindsight, if someone asks, hey, do you think that that was the most effective use of classroom time? I'd have to admit no, but it's interesting to introspect about why that was the instinct, why that was the thing that ended up actually happening.
Do you think it would have been the instinct had you not been raised in an education system that lectured to you every single day? It's like, I have no idea the answer to that, but that seems almost impossible to tease apart.
That's a very good point because, we follow the habits that we were exposed to in upbringing, right? Or we look at our role models and we kind of mimic the way that they do things. I think that's a big factor, but I don't think it fully explains it because, well, it can't fully explain it because otherwise it would be a circular argument, right? From whom did they learn or why did they tend towards that? I think there's some kind of gravity in this direction that might be amplified by the fact that we tend to copy what we have seen from others, but the core gravity, the core force pulling it in that way, I suspect is something else.
And you probably have teachers that you remember that were particularly effective and particularly good teachers that you look back on fondly. And is it perhaps the case that they weren't spending a lot of time lecturing? And so you did have this alternative model to follow, and yet you chose not to.
I can actually think of times when a flipped classroom model was attempted that stick out as being particularly bad, where the thought was, okay, we're going to have people learn from online lectures, pre-recorded lectures beforehand, and then we're going to do classroom activities once they come in. But then the classroom activities ended up being, I won't say poorly orchestrated, but aimless enough that the default was maybe the first 15 minutes the professor would actually spend kind of covering the things just in case people hadn't actually watched the lectures, just to make sure that everything was set up so that we could even tackle the activities. And then once that happens, people think, well, you don't really need to watch the lectures before because there's going to be that 15 minutes of warm up beforehand. And you get into this little snowball. And I imagine the intent was there. The stated intent of that class was to be a flipped model, but the way it evolved over the course of it was back in the direction of more time spent teacher up front telling things in this first contact way, despite the intent.
So did that inform kind of your impressions of what's effective and what's not? You saw this thing that is likely to be more effective, the flipped classroom, where you're making better use of classroom time and the teacher is doing more one-on-one instruction, answering more questions. But you have this example where you saw that happen and it actually didn't work.
Do you think that's it though, Eder? Do you think it's just a matter of seeing an instance of it not working? Tell me if right now I told you I have this classroom full of students, and for the next 10 weeks, I'd like you to come in, let's just say once a week, and do something with them for an hour to let them know the basics of circuitry. What influences do you look back to from your own education as you start thinking about what you're going to do during those 10 weeks?
I guess it's kind of a loaded question because I don't actually believe that it's my own experience, or I don't actually believe that it necessarily is your own experience of seeing things work or not work. I think the underlying answer to your question is lecture is just easier.
Yeah, right? It's comfortable, I guess.
So it wouldn't be the case that if you had me come into this classroom, I would look back and say, well, what has been effective? What has been less effective? And let me go with the thing that's effective. I would look at, well, how much time do I have to prepare? If I don't have a lot of time to prepare, well, I'm going to do a lecture because I roughly know the material and I can chunk it out into however many sessions there's going to be. And I can sort of decide this is what I want to cover. And I need to cover this in this session. And the one way to know that I've covered everything is to say everything.
So you raise an interesting point here, which is that time seems to be important, that a lecture requires less prep time. Is that necessarily true?
That's definitely a direction I was headed, is that it does give a sense of control.
It's really tempting to make an argument that we lecture out of a sense of control, I think. And that's where I feel you guys steering. I'm not totally sure I buy it. And control in many ways, right? Control in the sense of I'm a young teacher in North Carolina and I'm 22 and the kids are 18 and I can't behavior manage these kids, but if I don't give them the floor to ever say word one. And control in the sense of I'm expected by my principal to cover 10 topics and I can make sure that I said all 10 topics during the course of the period. I'm not totally sure I buy it.
Well, actually, can we dive into that, Stenhug? Tell me a little about, in more detail, your personal experience as the 22-year-old teacher in North Carolina. How'd you structure your classes?
So I'm entering teaching the first year of the Common Core. There's a new set of standards, and with that comes kind of this idea that everything from the past goes out the window. And also with those standards came this kind of expectation. I don't know if it was messaged as much as around active learning as it was just an expectation that the teacher should talk less. It was around students should be working in groups and students should be talking. There's a really, really, really big push on that. I never felt afraid to do that. I just never really knew how, and I'm not sure I ever got really good advice on how to do it. The people that were giving me advice, I think, were pretty good English teachers and social studies teachers, and it felt very different in the math classroom. To give you a very specific example, I remember just being really unclear. I thought students should be exploring and learning everything on their own, and I should be telling them nothing. And so I remember teaching trigonometry, and I didn't give them SOHCAHTOA. I didn't define the trig functions. I just gave them a bunch of triangles and had them play around a bunch. And the kids were engaged and they were playing around with triangles. But when you looked at the exit ticket results, no one had learned anything. And I went up to the other teacher who had been teaching for a few years and was really, really good. And I was like, hey, this is what happened. And he was like, you didn't give them the idea? What do you mean? How are they supposed to get anything? You didn't tell them anything. And I was like, oh. And that's when I kind of made this distinction of giving them a little fact and then having them explore it in a bunch of different angles, but having their exploration hinge on what I had given them. But it was really, really hard. And I never even got close to being good at it, I don't think.
So would this be maybe first 10 minutes of class, you are giving them the relevant seed and then you try to let them run with it after?
Yeah, I think that's the ideal. So they're pushing do now really hard, where maybe you're extending the seed from yesterday and then you're giving them some new information for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Hopefully it's in some sort of somewhat interactive way, even if it's a guided worksheet as you're lecturing. But you're going back and forth and they're doing their own work on the worksheet. They're not just sitting there copying down something from the board or just sitting there and passively listening. And then you have some worksheet or something to give to them afterwards where they're going to take what you've given and the questions are going to be just beautifully scaffolded so that they start with what you gave them, and then they're going to learn at every little step of the way and be super active and engaged in talking to their peers. I had tons of access to math questions, but to get like 10 questions that were perfectly scaffolded for my students who were 3 years behind grade level from where they were to where we want to be, it just didn't exist. So then you end up creating your own resources, and it just ends up being a mess because you're just spending all of your time doing that.
This is interesting, the idea that it necessarily seems to take more time. Part of where I'm coming from here, by the way, I was reading this article by a math professor named David Pengelly, and I'm definitely going to leave this in his show notes. I highly encourage anyone listening to this to take a look. He kind of described his personal experience of how exactly he moved away from the lecturing format. And there's a couple assumptions going into that. Things like never lecture on something that students can read instead. So, you don't even have to rely on the existence of a pre-recorded lecture. Just a good book would do it. But he highly emphasized the fact that you can't really trust students to actually do the reading before the class. And part of that is because they expect you to be talking about it. But part of it's unguided, right? It's a little bit like you putting out questions about trigonometry without a little bit on SOHCAHTOA. It's not entirely analogous because here it's the content, but it's without the questions. But equally, the questions without the content don't yield the kind of exploration that you hope for in setting out about this. But he was very emphatic about the idea that in the long run, it doesn't have to take more time. It still takes time to prepare lectures. And if instead you are comfortable being a little improvisational and a little bit nimble, where the entire point is almost to have not prepared too much other than collecting a few warm-up questions and getting a sense of what the misconceptions are, that ends up being a better use of people's time. And it doesn't take as much prep work, because the idea of doing prep work in isolation of feedback from the students or of some kind of information about what students think is true and what they might have misconceptions about is doomed to be inefficient in some way.
I think this is still another example of how it's perceived as harder, not because it necessarily requires more preparation. So kind of what you're talking about is sort of a guided discussion where you're covering the same things that you would cover in a lecture, but instead of lecturing and having a pre-prepared explanation of everything and an exposition of it, you're engaging in a dialogue with students, and you're allowing them to some degree to guide the discussion or to take the discussion where they want to go. And so you can include some of the sort of constructivist elements where students are constructing these ideas on their own, but they're not doing it completely on their own because they're working together as a group and also being guided by you as a teacher who can kind of give them each little step or help them see insights when they are wrestling with sort of random, like, well, let's try this, let's try this. You can point out like, hey, look at that one. That one seems to work, and kind of give them little nudges forward. And I see your point, which is that doesn't necessarily require more time. In fact, if you are confident with the material and you understand it well, you could probably do a guided discussion with a lot less preparation than you would need to do to prepare a lecture. Because when you're preparing a lecture, you've got to have a pretty good sense of everything you're going to say and how you're going to explain things and all the rest. Whereas in a guided discussion, you're kind of letting the students explain things, and you're helping reinforce the insights that they come up with and help them find reasons why the misconceptions are wrong, that sort of thing. But I think it's perhaps scarier because you don't know where it's going to go. The students could take it in any different direction, and you still at the end of the day are required to cover X, Y, and Z. And if you don't cover those things, well, you get to the end of your class and like, oh, damn, I was supposed to cover this topic and we didn't get to it. And that's frustrating.
I'm not clear what you mean by guided discussion. Like the image I have of active learning is kids in groups around circular tables and the teachers floating around. And there's really kind of nothing guided other than the questions or the project or the prompt the teachers given. But it seems like you're talking about something somewhere in between that and a traditional lecture.
Yeah, I think I'm talking about something that's a little bit different than the pure flipped classroom, which I guess is maybe worth kind of delineating, which is in the pure flipped model, the exposition of new material is done completely out of the classroom. Students are using their own time, either reading stuff, they're watching videos, somehow they're getting that material, and they're expected to come into the classroom having some understanding, having been exposed to the material for the first time some other way. And then they're expected to wrestle with problems, work in groups, work on their own, get help from the teacher, and so on. A guided discussion, I guess what I'm getting at is that's something more like a lecture, really, where the intent is to introduce new material, but to do it in a way that is more active than a truly passive lecture where students are just kind of sitting back and listening.
In the research I was looking at before this, they look at, it's not just binary, it's not just active or active learning or traditional. It's on a gradient, and the lowest form of activity is electronic clickers. So this kind of seems to me to be a little bit what you're talking about, Eder, at least like the teacher's lecturing and they pause and they let you input and answer, and then maybe that changes the way the lecture goes.
Okay, fair enough.
So that'd be the lowest. Then the research results, I think that doesn't match perfectly what you're describing.
I would actually think the lowest would be not even that. It's just, you're just listening. You're just consuming.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay, sure.
And then in this research, so they find effect sizes if you make it binary, but then they also find, and they love that they found this, and I do too, that the more active the classroom is, the larger the difference between that and a traditional classroom.
So you're saying the more active it is, the more effective the learning is what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So the full active, like work in a group on a project is more effective than the clickers is more effective than the no clicker traditional classroom.
But are they doing this in isolation? So, I mean, are they looking at a classroom that is 100% working in groups on projects, or there's still some lecture or some exposition of new material?
Yeah, there certainly is. I'm not sure. This was like a meta-analysis of 225 different studies, so they don't get into specifics on that. But yes, certainly in any classroom, you have some exposition of new material, whether or not that happens within the classroom or outside of it with assigned readings or videos or what have you. I think probably varies by case.
I think the important question is how to make sure that exposition actually, one, it should happen outside of the classroom, I would claim. But then the heart of it is, how do you ensure that it does? Right? Because otherwise you fall into that trap of no one's done their reading. So you have to start off with at least 15 minutes of recovery lecture, basically.
You just hold to it, man. You just hold to it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the point, right? Because it's like training a dog in some way, right? Like if the students know that 15 minutes are going to happen, they're not going to do the reading. But one of the points that David Pengelly made that I liked a lot is that students actually want to learn, right? Everyone's sitting there and they do want to learn. And if they buy your new system at all, if they see its benefits at least a couple of times, they'll go into it. They will actually do what needs to be done, especially if you don't give them that leeway and that excuse not to do it. So in his case, he would always make sure to have not just readings, but readings with some like warm-up questions that they're supposed to give. And he described the grading of it as literally 5 seconds for each one of them, because you're looking for a good faith effort. And you're also just trying to spot misconceptions. That kind of helps you guide what you're doing. But as soon as he actually used their answers to guide the questions and directly address what people had misconceptions about, that absolutely was a motivator for them to do the assigned reading and answer the assigned questions, because they knew that there wasn't going to be this redundancy at the start of class, and that was basically office hours, right? That kind of replaced the function that usually goes towards office hours.
So let me give you the 3 keys to making sure your students do the reading outside of class, and then we can dive in and you can evaluate.
This sounds like the kind of thing handed out in like a teacher manual. Like,
this is me off the top of my head right now, but I'm really excited about it.
Can you please make a pamphlet about it? Just the way that you opened it up there. It felt like the kind of dry thing that you would expect in like a teacher training course. Like, all right, everybody, these are the 3 R's.
And that pamphlet better have some generic clip art on it.
I got you on the generic clip art. Okay, number 1, students are like sincerely invested in their learning. Number 2, what you've learned about or read about is going to be actually sincerely used in the classroom the following day. If I have an experience where over and over again I have to read something, but it never actually matters if I read it, I'm not going to. And then number 3, and maybe this is a little bit of a bonus depending on the case, but having some sort of group or social pressure to have done it. So if I walk in and I'm on a group of 4 and we're going to work on a set of problems and it's going to be required that I've read it in order to be effective on those problems, I am going to be much more likely to read it. And I got this from the other experience I'll draw on is the data challenge lab at Stanford, where like learning data sciences guy Bill Bierman basically did exactly this with Hadley Wickham, who's a god amongst our circles. And he was just like, data science teaching is broken. Google is telling us that Stanford students 1, suck when they get there, and 2, learn really fast. And there could be no bigger indictment on an educational enterprise than to tell you that like someone that just came from there knows nothing and got it really quickly, right? Like you didn't do your job. And then he kind of created this environment. And this was exactly it. It was like, if I did the reading, I was a more contributing group member and I learned more in class and I really wanted to learn.
Oh, so tell me about the environment. You walk into the class immediately. Is it this group of 4 answering questions format?
It should have been. And he's moving there. He's iterating really fast on it quarter after quarter. The first, maybe, I think we meet for an hour, and the first probably 20 minutes it feels like logistics time. Like we all get together and talk about when things are due, and he'll go over a couple misconceptions he saw in the exercise from the day before, and maybe spend a couple minutes summarizing the readings, but usually not. But then where all of the actual learning happens is minute 21 through 60, which is exactly that. Yes, you have a problem set, you're sitting around with a group of four, you're expected to have read something. It's very brief what you're expected to have read the night before, because you just need enough to know where to get started, and then the problems scaffold you from where you were to really, really far into it.
I love those 3 points. And I wouldn't caveat point number 3 as having to be a bonus. I think that should be crucial, this peer pressure, because at the end of the day, that really is what motivates us in all sorts of aspects of life, is whether you have to answer to someone else. And the usual pressure of something like grades or like an end of semester outcome is really just a prolonged way of saying you're going to answer to someone else. And it's just that someone else is far away from you in time. But if the person that you're answering to is right there that day when you were supposed to have read the things, it makes for much more consistent reading rather than the cram and forget model.
I think I said as a bonus because in my mind, you're still going to have some percent of students without that social pressure that'll do it. I think it gave me the least big jump in percent adherence to reading, but I do think it's important nonetheless.
So I think it could also help kind of scaffold you to the first one, because that first point is you have to be invested in your learning. And you might come into a class not invested in your learning and not really knowing why you're there necessarily. You might have signed up for a program and the program says you need to take this class and you don't really know why and no one's ever explained it to you. You show up, you're not really that interested in it because it doesn't sound interesting. But once you are starting to learn it, you might then find, oh, this is really interesting. I can see why this applies. But you might need a little bit of a bootstrap to kind of get you there. And that peer pressure of you need to read the thing this week, otherwise you're going to feel bad sitting in your group not knowing what's going on, can be enough to kind of get you started so that you start to see enough of the content to start to understand why it might be valuable.
I'll give you a different example of a model where that was absolutely the driving force. So I did kind of a semester abroad at Oxford, and the way they structure things is just very different, where one, there's a lot more focus on tutorials that either might be one-on-one between, student and professor, you get together for an hour, or like a handful on one. In some sense, it's a very privileged thing to be able to do because you're Oxford and you have more money than you know what to do with. So if you want a student-teacher ratio of 1 for that time, sometimes you can do that. But the typical format, especially in like humanities environments, is that the student would write a paper during the week and then present the paper then and there, or maybe a little bit before so that the prof could take a look and then they discuss it. And there's no grades in the sense of you turn it in and a little bit later you get back a number on it that tells you how you did. Instead, the sole motivating factor here is you're going to be talking one-on-one with the professor about what you produced. And for that reason, you have all of the motivation in the world to make sure that it is something that represents what you know. And the actual grades and the important stuff happens in a much more separated circumstances of crucial tests, like at the end of the first year or the end of the third year, in a way that kind of hits the other end of the spectrum, where rather than a consistent little bit of motivation to know the thing, it's spaced out by 2 years as opposed to just finals at the end of semesters. But that's only because the tests are actually authentically meant to be just an examination of what you know at the end of your time there, rather than the forcing function to make you actually read the things at least once before the end of the semester, right? Because that forcing function is already there in the form of social pressure. I wonder how necessary it is to be in the privileged environment where you can have a handful of students to one. I think there's a lot of examples where you can have class broken up into many different groups, kind of like the Stenhag data science class that we're hearing here. And it just sort of circles back to what is the main roadblock? What is the main thing that needs to change before that's the first instinct? Like if I'm given a classroom full of middle schoolers and asked to do something, what is it that makes it so that my first instinct is to have that dynamic?
Something I've noticed about the few really good active learning environments I've been in is it seems like teachers can kind of have roughly on the extremes 2 different incentives or 2 different ways of operating. And way number 1 would be like, I want to maximize student learning. I really care about my students. Like I really, really want to maximize student learning. Those are the teachers that I've seen create like incredible active learning environments. And they're like really maximizing on learning. And then the other case, which is just kind of more of a risk aversion, and it's, I want to do a good enough job where I'm not going to get in trouble or I'm just going to like be happy with my job. And the quickest path to that, I think, is the lecturing. So I'm tempted to kind of characterize our desire to lecture as more of a risk aversion thing, to most quickly get me to the point where I'm sufficing, where I'm doing my job sufficiently as opposed to maximizing.
Risk of what in particular? Of poor test scores or of administrators questioning a different model?
Of administrators questioning, of maybe feeling bad about myself as a teacher, of things just going really awry in the classroom. Maybe that's just another way of saying comfort, but I kind of know what's going to happen if I stand up there and lecture. There's a wider variance in outcomes if I don't, I think.
Is it something around, you know that there are going to be some students who will learn it and they'll demonstrate on the test that they've learned it. And so you can, I don't know, in some sense, feel good at night knowing that the students that didn't learn it, you have some plausible deniability, I guess, that, well, it might not have been you, it was them, because you know that some students were able to learn. I mean, that's a very cynical way of thinking of it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. When it's phrased that way, it feels less true, but I'm not sure how to phrase it in a way that feels true to me.
If I can maybe draw what might be a tortured parallel, if I look at my workflow in creating videos, there's some aspects of it where you feel a sense of clear progress. Every hour of work corresponds to a known increased unit of production. Like if I'm animating something, like the script is there, I know what I'm saying. It's just kind of this nice little chug through of creating the things that I want to best illustrate that. And there's not much variance in how I feel like, oh, was that hour well spent? Was that hour not? But then there's other phases like that of writing where it's very easy to feel like a given hour was completely wasted. And it's hard to measure success or not in that way. And if I look at a classroom of students and either lecturing or trying to do something active, it feels like there's going to be more variance in a way that's analogous to writing when it's an active environment. When you say, okay, we're going to open things up, let things go in a less guided direction where I don't know the end point. And that might be where the good stuff happens. But you can very easily fear that at the end of the hour, we never really got anywhere. But when you're lecturing, you have this steadfast, this is the material I started with. It was chapter 8.3. And by the end, we're at the start of 8.4. And you know exactly how far that's going to be with the time allotted. And that's deeply comfortable. It has less cognitive dissonance associated with it. It's less worrying. If it's a topic that you're maybe a little bit less comfortable with, it certainly feels less risky than trying to field the questions that you couldn't anticipate from a totally open environment in a topic that you don't have the strongest foundation in to start with. So I can empathize hard on why that is a more pleasing way to spend one's day-to-day existence.
Maybe I mean this at like a variety of levels, and maybe that's where I'm getting confused, because I think you're describing one, like the most micro level really well, Grant. You're describing the level of just how do I psychologically feel as I'm teaching? Do I feel like I'm making some sort of progress? And I mean it in that way. I mean it in a slightly coarser level, which is I'm probably not going to get fired if everyone in my school is lecturing and I'm also lecturing. I mean it maybe on the school level, if every school in my district, I'm the principal, is like doing mostly lecture-based content, which is the case in 99% of districts. No one's going to get mad in the community. No one's going to get mad there. If I'm one of these universities that some of these articles talk about wanting to encourage having professors do more lecture-based stuff on the professor level, why would they do anything else? Like, they really have no incentive for it. At the university level, these universities are getting plenty of enrollment as is. Very few people are demanding anything other than lecturing. There's just a risk there that seems like it has no huge upside other than students more effectively learning. And it's sad that we can't make that upside be bigger almost.
I wonder if that's a broader problem with change in education in general, is there's this inertia that if you do what we've always been doing, then there aren't going to be any questions. Whereas if you do things that we know are actually going to be better, and we have reason to believe that they're going to be better, there's still a risk that you're not going to do them well. And then you've failed the students. And you've done it in this very risky way that it's hard to kind of explain what you were doing, because you tried this thing that, you know, there's research that suggests is going to be better, but it's the first time you've done it. There aren't a lot of great examples out there. And so you don't do a great job of it, and it actually is worse.
I feel like there's a very poetic parallel to be drawn here, where if you are a student learning an individual topic, you need to fail. You need to come up against something that you don't know and acknowledge it if you're going to learn the actual thing and increase what you know and increase your maturity with the topic. And then you zoom out from that, not looking at a student learning something, but looking at us as a society structuring education. And the only way that that can actually improve is if those in that system come up against things that fail, right? They try a different model that doesn't work. You are never going to make that progress unless you have a quarter spent with students where they actually learn less because you were trying something and it didn't go as well, but maybe you can tweak it for the next iteration. But if you're too afraid to ever fail on that macro level, in just the same way that a student too afraid to fail never learns the material, a system too afraid to fail never produces the learning paradigm that you need.
Yeah, and I think there's another parallel, another example of this with Common Core. When Common Core was first introduced, lots of reasons to believe that the standard is a better standard. It's a deeper standard. It's a richer standard. What happened was a lot of textbook publishers scrambled to create content aligned to these new standards. And some of them didn't do such a great job. And some of these questions got out and people looked at this and said, this is a terrible way to teach, or this doesn't make any sense, or I don't understand this. Common Core must be terrible. Let's throw it out.
That's a really good point. I never even thought about that. How
That's a great analogy.
yeah, like the textbooks, it's going to take them a couple years before they find the best way to present it. And all of the judgment is happening on the first products there.
And the standards are not easy to understand unless you're steeped in the sort of research that surrounds them. And so, it's also easy to look at the standards as a layman and say, well, these don't make any sense. I don't understand what this is saying. And frankly, it's easy as a content creator for a textbook publisher to look at it and not quite get it right. And so, yeah, of course, it's going to take some time.
Can you give me, Stenhog, the conclusion paragraph of your pamphlet here?
Yeah, no. Like, it's going to be risky and it's going to be hard and it's going to feel like you're doing something new and you're going to need buy-in from like your fellow teachers, your administrators, your students probably. But the one thing, like just the focus on learning seems to be just the kind of the escape out of any sort of problem you have. Just focusing on learning and just focusing on it and talking about how much the students are going to benefit. Carl Wieman, who's at Stanford and he basically won every prize in physics and then switched over to education to the surprise of all of the physics world. And what he said here makes me fear that we're going a little bit too far because we're describing like maybe there's these two curves of traditional versus active and it's going to take a year of teaching in the active way before it surpasses the traditional way or something. And we're going to have to go through that. And maybe that's going to be to the detriment of the first group of students. Carl Wieman, I heard him on a podcast. He basically said, lecturing is so bad. If you're in bed right now and you're like planning on giving a lecture in the morning, just like find a few problems somewhat related to what you're going to talk about and hand them out at the beginning of the time and just walk around and have people solve them with their laptops open Googling stuff. And it'll be way better than what you were planning on doing. And that kind of counters what we're talking about where there's this going to be kind of fixed cost at the beginning where it's going to be worse. And I don't know, I'm sure it varies by case, but that's a pretty strong statement there.
I like it because I feel like you kind of need a strong statement like that, right? Someone needs to be telling me if I'm like tasked with running a class, be afraid of lecturing. The risky thing to do is to give that lecture. That is not the fallback. That is as dangerous as simply not showing up that day.
Yeah.
Maybe even worse than not showing up that day.
And risky if your objective is purely defined as maximizing learning. But for teachers and for people running these classrooms, that sadly isn't the case, right?
That's kind of the saddest point you bring up is how the most influential factor here seems to be those who feel like they can afford to branch out of their comfort zone because they are motivated by active student learning. They don't have to worry about job security. They don't have to worry about answering to someone else. The top priority can be student learning. Because when I look back at my high school, I feel like I was blessed with a lot of very good high school teachers, but all in very different ways. It's not like each one was following this is the better way to run a class, right? These are more active in a predictable manner. Each one had their own unique character imprinted on what they were running. Some of them actually were a little bit more lecture focused. Some of them were reorienting when homework is done compared to lecture for a particular topic. And everyone, it was just a matter of once the teacher felt free enough to put their own character into their work, that seemed to be what made the difference more than any specific structural change.
So I wonder if this is a question of kind of what gets measured gets managed, in the sense that measuring learning is really hard, whereas measuring did you cover all the topics or even measuring test scores is much easier to do.
Yeah, I think that probably is the heart of the issue here.
Is it though? Because we're looking at research where active learning leads to better test scores on even tests that we admit don't measure exactly what we want.
So then what would be the disincentive for teachers then to not follow that research? There are some teachers who are evaluated based on test scores, for better or for worse. And oftentimes they sort of double down on let's make sure we cover everything in exactly the way that it appears on the test in a much more sort of lower level of learning, sort of rote a method, versus saying, oh, I'm being graded on tests. Research suggests that more active learning increases test scores, so I'm going to engage in these more active learning techniques. Why aren't teachers making that decision?
I have no idea. I think that's the hardest, that's the $1 million question, I think.
I think you're right to push back there, Stenhag, on the fact that it can't just be what we measure if we have this research. One factor here might be, if I can draw another sort of maybe tortured metaphor, do you guys know the sport racquetball at all?
Yeah, I've been wanting to play with you.
Yeah, okay. One, let's play racquetball. Let's put that there on the list somewhere. And then in a future podcast, we'll talk about it. But more importantly, the best player in the world, just no one disputes it. His name is Kane Wazelinchuk. And something that characterizes how he grew up with the game, he wasn't playing with a racket. He would have this empty 2-liter soda bottle that he would whack the ball around with in this very chaotic environment. And his style of play, people always note as being chaotic in contrast to other experts who are number 2, number 3 in the world. And there's a certain chess player who wrote this book, The Art of Learning, that I like a lot. He's not the best in the world, but he is a grandmaster. And one thing that kind of characterizes how he likes to play is to introduce as much chaos into the game to start. Make it something that is not, a known opening or not known patterns quickly, to be a little bit more dynamic. And I think that comfort in chaos is a common attribute of expertise in all sorts of fields, in a way that distinguishes the great from the phenomenal.
But is it that the chaos enables the expertise, or is it that the expertise enables the sort of freedom to be comfortable with chaos because you're confident in your abilities, because your abilities are strong?
I think it's the latter, and especially in competitive environments like racquetball or like chess, because if you are embracing that, it becomes a disadvantage to anybody who hasn't. It has this positive feedback loop, right? The chess games where he did throw it into chaos early are the ones that he won. And the racquetball games that had the wackier shots were the ones where Kane Wazelinchuk won. And that kind of reinforces that as a style, precisely because it's something that others don't dive into when there's not that extreme comfort with the field at hand.
But I guess I'm saying that it is the comfort that comes first that then allows the more chaotic experimentation. It's not sort of going in from the start very chaotically and then becoming comfortable in a chaotic environment.
I see what you're saying. I was describing how chickens and eggs go back and forth, but you're pointing to one of them as being the actual original.
Yeah, which is causal.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, that it is the comfort that is causal for the chaos that then starts feeding back. All I really care about in this point that I want to make is the correlation that exists, that those kind of go hand in hand. Because what it would mean is that in a classroom setting, which is going to be off book in some sense, this correlation between chaos and the expertise of those who enjoy chaos tend to be experts in it, and those who are not experts shy away from that environment, sort of points to the fact that to run a classroom like that requires more from the teacher when it comes to knowledge of the material itself and knowledge of the student's specific relationship with that material. It can kind of only be played by a grandmaster teacher in the same way that some of these games of chess could only ever be played by grandmaster players.
When you say grandmaster teacher, are you talking about a teacher who is a grandmaster in the subject that they're teaching, or a grandmaster in the craft of teaching? In other words, is being a grandmaster in the subject that they're teaching the thing that gives them the freedom to allow a chaotic environment because they have the confidence and the skills to sort of navigate and take it wherever direction it needs to go because they truly understand the underlying subject? Or is it the case that you're talking about a grandmaster teacher who has that skill, even if they aren't 100% confident, even if they aren't, the world's leading expert on the subject that they're teaching?
That's a really good distinction to draw. I think what I meant mostly was the second one. How if you see where a student doesn't know something, knowing how to steer them in the right direction, which I think kind of rests on an expertise in the material itself. One of them seems a superset of the other.
No, that probably is more of an expertise in teaching, because I think otherwise it would sort of validate what I think maybe isn't working in the university, which is having the world's leading experts teach, even if they may not be the greatest teachers.
Yeah, I can point to many examples of having been taught by great mathematicians and having learned nothing from them.
Yeah. So the expertise you're talking about is teaching.
Let's measure it by this. When a student asks a question, or if they are doing a problem set and they answer something wrong, knowing what to show them next as a skill to have is the specific like grand mastery that I want to point to here.
So I think it's all of it. I think we're getting way closer to the heart of the issue here. So the expertise of the teacher, what particular expertise is a little bit up in the air. So this research that I keep talking about, so Carl Wieman, who's now at Stanford and just absolutely top of this field, he's doing an interview with a blog called The Scientific American, kind of with regard to this research. And they're talking about why this doesn't happen at universities. Like, why are universities just lecturing students over and over again? He's been advocating to collect teaching method information from universities. So what % of math courses are taught with peer lecture versus other things? And he's kind of complaining that the NIH director, Francis Collins, won't do this. And he's expressing this frustration. And he's basically kind of blaming it on like the top universities or the top universities. So they have no inertia to kind of stir up the system at all and allow smaller liberal arts schoolers or anything else that could change their teaching style very quickly kind of to change the hierarchy. So then the interviewer says, should lecturing be abolished in K to 12 science classes also? I'm going to read this actually because I think it's really good and it's kind of expresses like a little bit of a not great view of teachers in some case. And I feel weird about having that. So the same principles of how people learn apply to all educational levels. I think most K-12 teachers would not expect students to listen to lectures, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically a talking textbook. But in these methods I'm talking about, you really have to think about how scientists think about and solve problems in a particular area and then design appropriate problems that have students practicing and learning and thinking. Then you have to be able to give the students feedback on how they're thinking. So it seems like that's kind of what you're talking about, Grant. This is a very demanding on your expertise in the subject. At the K-12 level, although there certainly are exceptions, teachers, by and large, do not have high enough content mastery to do this well. In large part, that's because they've been through college courses where the science is taught badly, so they never learn the subject very well themselves. They're graduating with a deficient understanding of the subject and a deficient view about how to teach it. So before you can expect K-12 science teaching to get much better, you have to fix the science teaching in the colleges and universities.
You know, I actually appreciate you taking the time to kind of read that because I can't help but feel like that's something that neither of the three of us necessarily would want to say because I don't necessarily know if any of us believe it, but it is worth putting out in the discussion, not just the lack of expertise on the teaching side, like we were just talking about, with the actual subject matter. On the one hand, obviously that's going to be a problem for any kind of education system, but how that addresses the specific question we're talking about here of the default to lecture, which is that the source of inertia might be, not that that's the easiest thing to do or the most risk-free or the one that you can feel confident about the test scores that will come out or anything, but just that that's the one that demands the least expertise. And that is the actual source of gravity here.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I read it, because I didn't want to say it myself, but it's a view that I think should be taken seriously. I mean, this guy's a Nobel Prize winning physicist and now top education professor at Stanford. Like, it's a view from a legitimate source.
It's an uncomfortable thing, but let's actually just throw it out there. Is it the case that teachers by and large don't know their subject material? I have so much respect for teachers that it just feels like some dude off on the internet saying that like teachers don't know what they're talking about, when in fact, many do, maybe most do. Maybe the specific question to ask here is just, do most teachers have a sufficient understanding of the actual subject matter, not the pedagogy surrounding it, to be able to teach something outside of a lecture format?
Well, let me flip this around a little bit and ask a question that might kind of get at this, which is, do you believe that, let's say, a third or fourth grade math teacher who's teaching some place value and multiplication using the standard algorithm, how important is it for that elementary school teacher to understand that the standard algorithm for multiplying multi-digit numbers is basically the same thing as multiplying complex numbers or multiplying polynomials?
It's tempting to say it doesn't actually matter because that doesn't come up. And I might even stick with that as my final answer here. But it does feel like being able to peek a little bit into the deeper patterns can give someone comfort in answering questions that students ask without being misleading, right? Without, for example, maybe dismissing ideas that students put out there that are interesting and are actual math later on, but might not make sense in a current context. You can imagine a student asking when you're talking about square roots, like, hey, what's the square root of -4? If it's like in a 6th grade environment, let's say, the tempting thing is to say it doesn't exist. it's not because like the teacher doesn't know what complex numbers are necessarily, but there exists an answer that you want to give, which is that will exist for you, right? Like what we're doing now treats that as not existing, but like that's the right question to ask. And it is indicative that you might be a mathematician that you even ask that, to be able to inspire in that way and kind of walk with students in all of the thoughts that they put out there without cutting those branches to veer it back on course. That's where I might actually think that even if it is in a grade school context, having a deeper comfort with all of the patterns as a whole could be necessary to doing a successful active learning environment.
Well, I think that's what I'm getting at, because we're trying to ask this question of, do teachers by and large have the experience necessary in the subject matters that they're teaching? And, I think I would argue that most third and fourth grade teachers do know how multiplication works and can teach multiplication relatively well. But I guess the question is, do they have this additional knowledge? And maybe most of them don't, or many of them don't, but do they need it? And is that what we're really getting at here?
So I don't think it matters. I'm tempted to say like before sixth grade or something is just a different beast, mostly. Because I feel Eder on the point that it feels like now the particular knowledge that he gave is so kind of distant from what's going to be happening in the classroom that it's hard to imagine that lack of that knowledge would affect what's happening in the classroom. Maybe you can make a point somewhere else that not knowing that knowledge is indicative of like a lack of understanding overall that's going to surface in small, little, subtle ways in the crispness of your explanation or in the way that you acknowledge what a good question is, that it should be kind of acknowledged instead of just being like, oh, we're not talking about negative numbers, or kind of dismissed in some way. But it's a hard argument to buy. I can much more buy. I mean, I was good at math. I taught like 9th through 10th grade, like even algebra. Some of that stuff's kind of hard, especially if you're preparing for it on a time pressure. And like, it's easy to remember all the answers that you're planning on lecturing about. Like that's hard stuff. I don't know.
But let me push back. I mean, at a minimum, I would think that a great elementary school teacher, I would want them to have a general understanding of what mathematics is as a field and the meaning behind this idea that mathematics is really just rules that we've made up, and you can make up whatever rules you want and try different things. And some rules work and some rules work together. And those are things that move the field forward, and there are rules that don't work. And so if you want to invent something for a square root of a negative number, that's a valid thing to do. And you can explore that and you can see where it leads you. And maybe that is what this paper that you just quoted is kind of getting at, which is if the teaching at the collegiate level isn't imbuing that sort of intuitive understanding of what the subject is, if it's focused just on doing ever more advanced mathematics, but not really talking about that sort of definition of math, maybe that's what's missing.
Yeah, I feel you. So what I was struggling with your example was imagining a mechanism by which lack of knowledge of Y would influence a student doing X in second grade, but you've got me sold on this like overall mindset and view towards math as being really important for student learning.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that you've got to understand what mathematics is. I guess what I'm saying is it's kind of hard to imagine someone who really has a deep understanding of what mathematics is, but that doesn't see the parallels when they're teaching the standard algorithm for multiplying multi-digit numbers, to see the parallels elsewhere.
So if we can wrap a little bow on this discussion right now, one of the main triplet of points that Stenhung brought up earlier about necessary ingredients before any kind of alternate system would work being on the student side, that they genuinely want to learn. Wow, what was point number 2 again?
So what did I say? Number 1 was you have to have students actually bought into learning. And then 2, what you read about or what you're experiencing outside of class has to actually matter within the class you're going to step in the next day.
Yeah. And then number 3, that you have kind of a social pressure to be doing that prep work that goes in. And then maybe like on the flip side, we can say that from the teacher's perspective, like necessary ingredients to fight back against this inertia is, one, I really like that quote you brought up about how if you're planning on lecturing, that will be strictly worse than if you go in with any questions at all and give them to the students and have them do that. So maybe ingredient 1 is a visceral fear of the effects of lecturing like a disease, which is a harder statement than it needs to be, but it's an escape velocity kind of question, right? It's pushing hard because there is this strong gravity in the other way. But like an unfortunate other ingredient into that is this expertise that we're talking about. If it's actually the case, Eder, like you're saying, that a successful elementary school teacher needs to have a strong conception of what math as a whole is about, that's like a strong labor shortage issue, right?
Oh, yeah.
If that's one of the necessary ingredients, and I'm willing to throw it on there as one of them, but it makes it all the more depressing and all the more clear why this inertia exists. But then maybe kind of point number 3 is just being in a position where you actually can experiment. And if that's a position in your own self-comfort, in your own like schooling environment with like administrative support, whatever it might be, having the willingness and privilege to put your own character into the work, that might be where I put the sources of this inertia. Is that a fair sum up, you think?
I think that's a great sum of where we are right now, yeah, in the conversation. I think we missed something really important. I guess I'll do it from personal story. So my second year of teaching, the students had laptops, which came from this old, basically some company was really evil to my students in North Carolina as a tobacco company, and they had to give a bunch of money to the school system, and then we become a one-to-one school. And so all the students have laptops, but I just made students not take them out during math class the first year. And then the second year, I kind of wanted to do more of this sort of active learning thing. And I was like, oh, well, maybe we can do some blended learning. I had heard of Khan Academy, etc. And so I started to use Khan Academy in my classrooms. Kind of similarly, I'd ask them to watch videos at home, but that'd get messy. So they'd end up watching them in class and then working in groups on the problems. And what I think, like, why does it matter to have a lot of content experience or have a lot of subject experience? Well, yeah, lots of random little questions are going to come up, but it's all about like what are the problems that students are going to be solving? Like what is the actual scaffolded experience they're going to be going through? And every single good active learning experience I've been in, the actual teacher that I was talking to was the person that wrote the problems, which to me as a teacher seemed like just a wild world. Like, wait. Everyone, like there's millions of students learning Algebra 1, but all the teachers are designing their own questions at home the night before. Like, how does that make any sense? But then when I use Khan Academy in my classroom and I'm going through, I kind of get it for 2 reasons. One, the questions just, they're all there and they're related to Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 or whatever we're talking about, but they're not structured in a way that's tight enough, especially for my students who are kind of struggling to keep up, where they might throw a negative sign in and a negative sign completely just throws my students' world upside down. And especially if I'm not aware that that's going to come, now like the whole classroom's kind of flipped upside down. Now Khan Academy's restructured and done a much better job of aligning with the Common Core since then. But this idea of where are the resources coming from, and right now the way we share content resources often is like with item banks or with individual worksheets that kind of feel disconnected from a curriculum and things. Like it just seems like it's just such a weird world. Now maybe that's an open question of like, in order to have a good active learning environment, does the instructor have to be the one that creates the problems? In my experience, that's always been the case, but it doesn't seem like it should be.
Right now, as you're looking and you raise this question of there's millions of students learning Algebra 1 and yet each teacher is tailor making things. Do you think that's necessary? Is that the conclusion here? Or is it even possible to have the universal question bank?
So the question bank's flawed because the items need to be scaffolded so tightly and so perfectly to go from where the student began, which is what they experienced last night, to where you want them at the end of the class period, that it has to at least come in the format of a set of questions that are going to happen in an entire class period. But once you get there, that feels shareable, but I've never seen it done in a common way. And I've asked probably dozens of teachers at this point that swear by creating their own resources. And they use the same thing year after year, which makes the first couple of years of teaching just absolutely treacherous, but the later years a little bit more sustainable. And they'll all say it takes as much time to study someone else's questions to understand the question well enough to teach it well as it does to just darn well create it yourself.
I hear that, and I just can't help but feel like that's got to be inefficient. Is it just a matter of the ownership that comes with it? That kind of sounds like part of this, right? That it's less that the greatest necessary questions don't exist out there, but the mere fact of creating it yourself gives that sense of ownership of the classroom that can't be mimicked.
I think you were getting at it. Actually, I mean, this resonates for me a lot because I've taught things where I've used materials that other people have created. I've also obviously created my own material. And that definitely resonates for me in the sense that you really do need to understand why each item follows from the previous one and exactly what the objective of each item is. And I think obviously if you create it, you know what that is going in because you're thinking that through. If someone else has created it, it might not be obvious to you. And so to your point, it takes almost as much time to understand what someone else did than it did to create it yourself. But I think it is important to sort of know why you're going from one to the next and what is different about this item from the previous item. And unless you really study it, try it yourself, it's hard to necessarily understand the subtlety from one item to the next.
When I hear you talking about that, what it makes me think of is that maybe what we should assign to students is not just to answer questions, but to come up with their own that are meant to be given to others. I remember there was a time in a history class, I must have been some sort of very annoying student because somehow I was complaining about a quiz and I wasn't the best at history. So it was probably, I just like didn't know it. And this was exposing self-consciousness. I don't know what it was, but my history teacher was very smart because she was like, all right, Grant, you know what? How about for the next quiz, I let you write it? Which I was like, wait, seriously? She's like, yeah, the next quiz, you write it, you distribute it to the class, their grades will be based on it, and it should be an accurate reflection of whether or not they learned material. I was like, wait, seriously? And she was serious. So I did that for the next chapter. And needless to say, I read that so much more thoroughly and put so much more thought into the content underlying that because the process of coming up with the questions was so substantively different. And for the same reason that it gives this ownership for the teacher creating their own class, maybe that's the right recipe to give students ownership over the material in and of itself, is have some kind of dynamic where what they need to produce are questions. And for the social pressure reasons, those questions actually have to be given to others because otherwise it won't have the same weight.
I buy it as a super awesome learning experience, but I think in order to get a student prepared to write questions for their peers, we still need good questions to offer them, and the teacher has to generate those, right?
Oh, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. It wouldn't be the first assignment about that. Maybe in preparation for a final exam, right? To write your own final exam, something like that, where you should have had a little bit of exposure and practice with the material already, but it's kind of a solidifying force.
You're definitely hitting on something because evaluation is kind of the top level of Bloom's hierarchy. If you're familiar with the Bloom's taxonomy of learning, there's sort of different levels of learning, and evaluation is the top level. So being able to evaluate someone else is kind of the most challenging thing.
Like this taxonomy is over measures of how well you have to learn something in order to be able to do a given task.
Yeah. So I think, at the bottom, that first level is rote memorization of something. And then, the next level up is do you sort of understand it? And then it kind of goes on to being able to apply it and being able to extend it and transfer it to other domains. And then evaluating is one of the top levels.
Yeah, it reminds me of a statistic I once heard where, the kind of statistics you hear where you're like, what possible study produced that? But it's a fun anecdote, so you remember the numbers anyway, even if you don't believe them, where people remember 20% of what they read, about 30% of what they listen to, about 70% of what they interact with in some kind of meaningful give and take way, and about 90% of what they teach. Where, again, I don't know where those numbers come from or if I believe them, but purely as a possible fictional anecdotal study, I just think that's very reflective of my own experiences.
Yeah, sounds plausible. I guess what I was getting at with the sort of levels of learning is also, you can't necessarily just jump to the top one. You can't just start out and say, write a test on this subject. You kind of got to scaffold your way there. And I suspect your teacher realized you'd already kind of made it a fair amount up that ladder.
So related to Bloom's and to the level of learning is, I think, another important point, which is the types of questions that you want to drive an active learning classroom, I think, are very different than the types of questions that are typically assigned from the book after a traditional lecture is given. I think they're much closer to the higher of Bloom's taxonomy, and they're much harder to find.
Would it be fair to add to the sort of summary here that point number 4 for necessary ingredients on the teacher side is creating your own forms of evaluation? Is that kind of a conclusion here, that is necessary to this structure?
Yeah, that's fair because it relies so much on the context that you have coming in, which is hard to write in the abstract. I would term it as understanding the curriculum, and a good way to do that is to write it yourself.
So that's kind of a subset of the point about expertise.
So my question is really practical, actually, and maybe could get to this. I don't know of any place a teacher could go to get good, like full sets of questions that you would facilitate a classroom around. I know places where you can find good questions, but they're just single questions. I know where to find worksheets, but they're pretty much terrible questions. There's online resources, which will help you, but it's mostly kind of the drill and kill variety, or at least erring on that side for, I think, what you'd want kids doing in a group. But I just don't know of a place where like you just find these like sets of questions that scaffold on each other, but are like near the upper end of Bloom's taxonomy and are really good. Which is thus why you tell me to go teach a classroom tomorrow. I don't know where to get those problems. It's a lot of work to create those the first time. We're lecturing.
All right, this will be a 10-minute closer on something completely unrelated, totally anecdotal, but I really do want to hear your guys' take. I'm not that into sports necessarily. Like sometimes I am, sometimes I can get into it, but it's not something that I'll follow myself. It's only ever going to be because like friends bring me into it in some way. So as you guys may or may not be aware, there was a particularly big fight that happened the other night. You know about this, Stenhug?
Oh, I know all about it.
You want to give a little summary?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Really, either?
No.
Oh, that's...
And I wouldn't have either if not for this.
Oh my gosh. So we've got Mayweather. He's 49-0. He's 40 years old. He had retired from boxing. And so Mayweather is a black guy, 49-0, retired. Now he got challenged by Conor McGregor, who's 29. He's Irish, very, very Irish. And he's just a champion of... was it Ultimate Fighting? I'm less experienced in that, but he's champion of Ultimate Fight. Is that what it is?
I've heard MMA, like mixed martial arts. Is that the right term to use? I'm the ignorant one here. But...
I'm not sure. I'm as ignorant on this point. So he's playing some sport. He's extraordinarily good at some sport that's close to boxing, but has fewer rules.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of challenged Mayweather to a boxing match, and it becomes, I don't know, the publicity around this just becomes absolutely incredible. Because they have the weigh-in and they talk beforehand, and you get to see Conor McGregor yelling at Mayweather that he can't even read. It's just nasty stuff going back and forth. And these guys both are going to earn just millions upon millions and millions of dollars. This is on the magnitude of half of the relative importance of the Super Bowl. Similar amounts of betting happens in Vegas as to the Super Bowl. And this is just a gigantic event that's probably going to last 15 to 20 minutes, which just blows my mind.
So I knew nothing about it. I show up to hang out with some friends on the afternoon when this is happening, not knowing that the game is going to happen, right? I'm like, all right, so let's do some stuff. And later on, they bring up this game, and at first I'm a little uninterested. I'm like, this just seems like, paying people to fight each other, and don't people sometimes die doing this? Seems a little strange. But then I become totally into it, partly because I have some Irish roots, and so I'm kind of looking like at this aggressively Irish McGregor character and feeling like, all right, my boy, let's see if we can make this happen, especially because it's going into a different sport, right? It's weird. It's like having someone who's a squash champion challenge like Federer at tennis. Very strange. So it's pay-per-view, right? And the event, Eder, do you want to give an estimate on like what the cost is for if you're going to do the pay-per-view to like watch it at home?
I have no idea. I'm going to guess $20.
So it's $100.
Wow.
Right? So that's interesting.
Okay.
It's, like people become price insensitive when it comes to fights, which is fascinating to me.
For 20 minutes of action.
Right. And it's pretty much for like 20 minutes, right? 20 minutes of actual substance. And they have like a whole thing around it. And they're just like...
Which is available. I mean, is this available after the fact on YouTube or some?
Oh, that's a good question. Do you know, Stenhug?
I'm not sure about the full fight, but ESPN definitely showed like video highlights.
I think it's fair to say that the demand to be there in the moment watching it live is what leads people to be willing to spend $100 for basically 20 minutes. There's surrounding stuff like other fights, but really they're there for that 20 minutes.
That's the value that you're paying.
This raises kind of an interesting question because, and then obviously I'm going to like hang out with him and I watch the fight afterwards. And then afterwards, sort of the question arises for like, all right, if everyone wants to pay for this game, right, that we've watched collectively as a group of 6 or so. And on the one hand, I'm not cheap. I don't usually think of myself that way. But I did I was like, hang on, should I necessarily feel the need to like pay for this, right? If it's something where you're coming in, like I would have hung out the other night, they would have watched it anyway. It feels a little bit like arriving and they're like, hey, do you want to join us for a night of pizza? And you're like, yeah, sure, I'll eat. And like, by the way, the pizza was $100. It's like, whoa, wouldn't have done that on my own. I'm usually not a pizza person. I kind of went outside of my comfort zone to eat pizza just because it was like with my friends and such. I guess the question I want to pose to you guys is just the moral one of like, should I have felt obligated to pay for the relevant part of the $100 20 minutes?
That's a great bit. That's fantastic. I guess, I mean, it feels like you are more accepting that payment is happening if you're there when the group decides to buy it versus if you walk in and it's already been purchased.
No, I think it was already done. Or I wasn't paying attention when that, why would that matter if I was watching when the numbers were punched in?
Maybe you should have paid attention, write them down and get your $100 back. No.
Let's say, I don't know if it was purchased before or after, but let's just say with or without like me there. It's not that they were looking for a quorum of 6 before this would actually happen, right?
This wasn't a fight viewing party that you got an invitation to.
Right, and then that's the other thing. Like, if it, like, it didn't come to watch the fight in particular. And I'll just say, like, at the start, before this question even came up, in my mind, I was like, whatever the resolution, I think the right thing to do will be to pay. But it's kind of like that was the conclusion that I knew I would come to, but I didn't know if it was justified or why. Like, it's an interesting sort of social position to be in.
So it seems to me that kind of the first opportunity to avoid this was someone noticing, hey, Grant wasn't super into this, or Grant wouldn't be buying this, and then bringing it up without you. Because it's a tough thing to bring up yourself.
A relevant factor here, like I said, is like at the start, I totally wouldn't be into it. I didn't even know about it. It's not something I would have opted to. But I do have to admit, I got into it. I buy the story that they're telling, and I see sort of the PR doing, and it's working on me, and I'm invested in the curiosity of how this thing will go. And in that sense, was probably as emotionally into it as anyone else once the thing actually got rolling.
You didn't like put a blindfold on and say like, nah, not consuming.
In contrast, I will say that like my girlfriend who was there also basically did that. She was just like wandered off into a different room and was doing something else. And at the end of the night, when they're like, all right, like people want to chip in and they're counting the number of people, she was just unabashed like, well, clearly I'm not part of this, right? In a way with fewer questions or hesitations.
When you were watching, did you know it was expensive?
Yes. But suppose that was to change the decision, right? It's like you come there, you're like, oh, you guys are watching this thing? You're like, yeah. They're like, pay-per-view. You're like, oh, how much? And they're like, $100. Is the thing to do then to be like, well, see you later, and kind of walk out if it's something you're not into?
See, I think you were stuck. I think morally you had no obligation to pay, and I think you would have been fine as your girlfriend did. Just say like, well, I didn't come here for this. I'm not paying. I think the problem is that it's sort of conformance is a strong pressure in human nature. And this is what you were stuck with, is everyone else was sort of pitching in and you felt this pressure to conform with the group. And it doesn't cost much to do that. And the downside is that perhaps it hurts your friendships. And so you pay. But I don't think morally you're obligated to.
So if you put yourself in the same situation, and relevant to that situation is that you did enjoy the actual event, right? It was a genuine bit of entertainment in that moment. Can you walk out there not paying and feel comfortable?
No, I would want to pay, and I wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't, but that's not because it would have been wrong to not pay. It's because, that feeling of wanting to conform and fit in would be overpowering.
So this is not doing it because it's the right thing, but it's purely a matter of peer pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I bet if you had said, this wasn't part of the deal when I came here, I mean, it would have been uncomfortable for you. Maybe people look askance. I wouldn't be surprised if a few other people said, oh yeah, me neither. Because it's much easier then to join that sort of contingent of like, well, I didn't come here for that, or I didn't, this wasn't my idea, or whatever excuse you come up with.
I will say, I feel like others were there for the fight. It would have been harder for that chain of denial to really take off.
They've all got their money team shirts on and you just arrive just typical Grant apparel.
Something like that, yeah. I wasn't wearing an Irish flag around my neck.
They've all got boxing gloves on. Yeah, it seems like practically it's very obvious that you just pay and just move on with life. The moral argument.
The actual resolution was kind of funny. So I brought this up just because I wanted to discuss it as a moral question, but it was obviously impossible to remove it as a moral question from me just like seeming cheap in that moment. So I was in particular chatting with my brother where he's like, what? No, like you just pay for the thing. And as an example, I wanted to bring up like, okay, earlier today, I had been out to eat and I thought you might be hungry when I got here and I like got you something like to take out, and I had no expectation of you like paying me for that. I just wanted to bring you lunch because I thought it was a nice thing, and it would feel like kind of a jerk move to be like, hey, I got you this lunch, and by the way, like you are obligated to buy it from me, so just for you. And then the resolution was, by example, he's like, oh, decided to pay me for that meal in that way, in a way that more or less like balanced out what I was paying for the share of the thing. Because realistically, it's like if you have a group of people watching the $100 thing, it's like the price is just kind of like going to a movie. It's not actually, hey, Grant, you have to pay all $100. So it ended up coming out where net, I was actually the same, because instead of having bought someone a lunch for free and gotten the entertainment for free from someone else, it was just that both of those went from being social exchanges to economic exchanges. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're sort of rationalizing, but
maybe I'm rationalizing, but it felt, even though like the total net money exchange afterwards was like net zero, I feel like there would have been something more congenial, more camaraderie represented if I had given them the lunch and not expected anything back. and they had like watched the game, and I happened to be there, and it wasn't like expected of a contribution of from all parties who happened to be there.
Forget the moral stuff and who paid for what. Like, bro, what'd you think about the fight?
Yeah. Oh man. So as soon as I started to learn a little bit about it, about how this McGregor character did not come from a boxing background and that boxing has so many more rules in it, I'm sitting there just thinking, he's just going to be breaking all the rules, right? He's coming from an environment where you can do not anything you want, but like a lot. Whereas in boxing, it's like, oh, you can't hit someone in the back of the head. You can't do this. You can't do that. And I'm just thinking, he's going to go in there and like break all of the rules, and it's going to be nothing but like the ref just constantly breaking them apart, which was not far off from how it looked. I don't have enough experience to see in other boxing matches like how often it's the case that the ref has to come in and like tear them apart. But what was funny is just how clearly the ref was like a little angry at the Irish guy coming in, at the outsider from boxing. Is like, I've been very clear with you about what the rules will be, and you just keep breaking them, and kind of having to overcome the testosterone packed environment that was. But I was surprised it lasted as long as it did, just because I'm thinking, you have someone from a different sport who comes in and like tries to challenge like a world dominator. It's I thought it would be over within 3 rounds, but
it looked to me at the beginning like McGregor was actually winning.
Well, okay. I mean, I feel like he kind of came out there just guns a-blazing, a little bit like a manic gorilla, just throwing punches. And it didn't seem like he was actually winning. It looked like the other guy just actually had control in a way that McGregor was just throwing raw energy into the event.
Yeah, I feel you on that.
But there was a part of me that was sad, that the little Irish part of me that was sad that he didn't pull through and give us an underdog story. Though it's not really an underdog story, I guess, right? Because he's kind of world champion in this other domain.
Yeah, I'm just fascinated by that. The fight was cool, but just the eaters kind of quandary, like, how in the world did they get so much publicity and all this money? And it's just hard to understand.
Ben Stenhaug back with you to wrap things up. Aside from the boxing talk at the end, I found that conversation to just be absolutely fascinating. One thing that I don't think we hit on directly, we kind of skated around it, is just the psychological illusion of the lecture. I know it on both sides. When you are a teacher and you are lecturing, you are under some sort of illusion that students are learning. I think if you estimated how much learning is happening when you're lecturing and how much they're understanding, you would vastly overestimate that. And similarly on the other end, when you're sitting there passively listening to someone talk, I think we vastly overestimate the degree to which we are understanding and comprehending and retaining and building understanding in our brains. And I think that psychological illusion is a pretty big part of this. What we didn't really suggest, I put together my pamphlet in the podcast, but I don't know if we got all the way to like how to fix this problem. And it's very clear to me that there's a great deal of activation energy required to get past lecturing and into active learning things. Whenever someone says, as the example was, that we should be doing something, lecturing comes to mind. It takes no creativity to come to mind. We can imagine it very clearly. We have all of the resources set up, the PowerPoints and the projectors. We can record videos. If you look at why is Grant making incredible YouTube videos as opposed to creating incredible interactive math experiences? Perhaps that's because it's a gift of his more than anything, or perhaps it's because we have the ability to record audio and make lectures and make videos nailed down, whereas the ability to create interactive math experiences is not something our technology is extraordinarily good at in a way that scales. So there's challenges everywhere, but if we can make the activation energy a little bit lower. A few logistical things. If you check out the show notes, you'll see a link to a Patreon page. That's a chance for you to contribute, donate, support us. It would be greatly appreciated. Mainly, we want to raise money for the cost of an editor for each of these podcast episodes. They're really fun to create, and paying an editor is part of the process. So if you can help with that, it'd be greatly appreciated. As a bonus, as a sign of our gratitude to you, there's a couple of additional podcasts that you'll get access to if you donate. One, which I'm personally really, really excited about, is I Tell the Story. And Ben and Blue walked me through the story of when my friends and I capitalized on a mistake that the sports betting site TopBet made. And we made made over $10,000 based on this mathematical mistake that they made. And we talk about it in all the hilarious situations around that situation. So donate, you'll get access to that. And also there's an additional podcast there too. If you don't have the funds, if you don't want to donate this time, one other way that you can support us that would be greatly appreciated is find us on iTunes. Give us a rating there. That helps podcasts greatly. They're just starting out, and it'll help us continue this really, really fun ride. Last thing, in the show notes, there's an opportunity for you to jump into a subreddit and contribute. Keep the discussion alive. Share your thoughts. Share any resources. Share any experiences that you've had. And we would love to hear from you and hear what you think on this matter.